The wind found the ridge before dawn, a cold, uninvited thing that came down from the high pines and turned breath to white when Jack Redfern stepped to his threshold. He had lived long enough on that slope to know the sound of weather, how the gullies took it and how the old boards complained, but that morning the wind carried beneath its empty voice a softer one, a knock, practiced and small, as if someone had trained themselves to sound like a part of the house rather than a stranger. Jack stood with one hand on the door. The kettle hissed on the stove behind him, uselessly, already hot from an earlier thought of coffee. He could have let the sound go. He had let things go for years, the small petitions of other people's lives, the trouble that wasn't his to risk for. He had made peace with the shape loneliness took. It fit him like an old coat. The cabin had always been a place that kept things simple, one place at the table, one cup to wash, one bed that made no room for company. When he opened, the world pressed in with cold and a single figure. She stood back from the threshold, cloak pooled wet at her boots, hair dark and straight against the white of her cheek. There was snow dust in the hollow of her shoulders and the faint print of a long ride in the set of her jaw. She did not raise her chin, did not offer a flourish of story. She looked like someone who could find her way through a blizzard and choose to come to a door on impulse, because doors still meant shelter in that country. She spoke in a voice like pressed cloth, close to the wood. "May I stay tonight?" The words were small, almost a prayer. Jack felt them more than heard them, as if they had landed on his chest and left a bright bruise. He found himself still, the way a man is when something unexpected freezes the circuitry of habit. For a long time, long enough to name it fear, he held to the posture that had kept him safe. Uncommitted, uninterfering, the sort of man who minded his own and let the rest pass. This was not a moment for decisions. It was a moment that required only the simple human kindness that he had not practiced in a while. He could have said no and closed the door. He could have asked for credentials, a story, a proof. He could have sent her on to the next cabin, to the next ridge, to the indifferent sweep of the plains. Instead, his hand lowered, the latch came back, and a man who had spent his life building fences opened his threshold to a woman whose name he did not yet know. She came in with her boots careful on the worn plank, and the smell of pine sap and rain filled the small house. She set her cloak on the peg by the stove without request or apology, turned the hem to drip, and then, because some rituals require no speech, moved to the hearth and began to loosen the kettle. Jack watched, all the previous self-protecting habits routed by surprise and a stubborn, immediate gratitude. He busied himself with the only thing that felt like a bridge, putting coffee on the stove, filling 2 tin cups from the jar under the sink. They did not ask each other's names at first. It would have been clumsy, like naming a passing cloud. Instead, they settled into motion. She folded the wet cloth of her sleeve and tucked it inside her bag. He set out a second place at the table without meaning to note the gesture as anything more than a practical habit. Steam rose, mapping their breath in the low light. The sound of the wind against the cabin was a long, low string under everything. She moved with quiet surety, a hand that knew knots and the right place to push a stubborn drawer back into line, fingers that held the blade steady as she shaved a sliver of bread for the stew. There was no showmanship in the way she worked, only competence and a refusal to be managed. When she reached for the kettle, she did not ask where he kept it. She remembered the pattern of the house, like the lines of a trail. He watched. He listened. He said nothing for a long time, not because he had nothing to say, but because saying names felt like an invitation to belong. She did not press for it. In the pause between them, ordinary things gathered their own language, the clink of a spoon, the scrape of a chair against the floor, the way 2 sets of hands rubbed warmth into cold palms. They ate slowly, as if time were a resource to be sampled rather than spent. Outside, the wind sharpened its knives on the ridge. Inside, the 2 tin cups at Jack's table became a small pact. He noticed absurd things about himself that night, how his fingers reached automatically for a single cup, then corrected to two, how he placed the kettle nodally closer to the second seat, how sleeping with the door latched felt less an act of defense and more an act of stewardship. The house, which had been a shelter for a solitary man and his ghosts, began to rearrange itself as if it expected another presence to remain. When the first shaking of dawn came, it found them at breakfast. Nessa, Jack later learned that was the name on the soft reply when he finally offered his, moved with the same unobtrusive authority in daylight. She made a bed without fuss, mended a torn strap, took a hammer to a shelved board that had been sagging for months. She kept her face because she did not owe it to him to reveal what lay behind the reserve. He saw only the small, confident lines of habit, a hand that showed no surprise at toil, a back that took load without complaint. Jack knew how to watch the weather and the ways of cattle. He knew rust on a hinge and the best place to staple a binding back into a ledger. There were things he had not known he missed until she started doing them. The way a cup left in the drying rack could be turned to face the other direction because another person might reach for it. The way firewood was stacked, not in a solitary tower, but in two small, neat piles. He found himself preparing 2 breakfasts in his mind long before his hands moved, waking before the sun in a way that felt like the reformation of muscles that had atrophied. Outside, the ridge opened to the world like a dark mouth. Inside, the rituals became a language that did not need translation, the passing of a preserved jar at the right moment, the recognition of a kettle tuned to the kind of tea she preferred. She offered small corrections to the way he had lived, not by saying he was wrong, but by the way she held the spaces they shared. His habits were not condemned, they were simply answered by another pattern that fit alongside. When he finally asked the inevitable question as to why she had come, it was not a test. It was curiosity wrapped in the bluntness of a man who had not been taught to ask much else. She looked up from the board she was planing and gave him an answer that was not a history and not an excuse. "I needed shelter," she said. "I needed a place to warm. I had no more to do than travel east with the wind." There was no complaint in it, no accusation directed at the others who might have refused her, no request beyond the immediate. She had not come to unburden him with a story. She had come with the singular human petition that had determined the shape of the day. "Let me stay tonight." It was a line like a hinge, small, functional, decisive. Jack's mind prodded its past then. The kind of memories that come not in cinematic flash, but as small, fitful returns. Images of times he had watched something unfair and chosen stillness. Of men he had turned away because the stakes were not his. Of nights he had counted the cost of sticking his neck out and found it cheaper to withdraw. He remembered a summer when a neighbor's barn burned, and he had stood with his hands in his pockets as others passed buckets. He remembered a boy in town who had been shoved and laughed at while the rest of them pretended the shove was sport. The list was neither long nor heroic. It was ordinary, and therein lay its weight. In the quiet after the breakfast, she found a spool of thread and began to stitch the seam in his sleeve he had habitually ignored. Her fingers worked with a patience that made even mendings look like prayer. Jack watched the needle go in and out, the small, regular motion, and felt something in him that wanted to be better than habit. A day fell between them, made of chores and the low, steady conversation of 2 people learning a new rhythm. They repaired a leak under the sink together. He held the pipe. She turned the wrench with an unhurried hand. They split wood in tandem. She had a way of swinging the axe that saved his shoulders. She taught him to hold a knife for paring rather than for threatening. He taught her where the preserved beans were stored and how to judge a winter barley by its smell. They argued once about how to hang a new shelf. The argument was civil and brief, the kind that slips away into laughter because both of them preferred usefulness to stubbornness. That evening, their hands met on a nail and lingered a beat longer than necessary. Neither made a dramatics of it. The moment of contact was more like acknowledgement. We are now in each other's orbit. Small rituals altered the topology of Jack's day. He found himself waking with the instinct to make a second cup, reaching into the dark for 2 mugs rather than 1. He found his coat, arranged not in solitary folds, but with an imagined second sleeve. The change was not sudden, and it was not presented as salvation. It was a steady, domestic kind of healing. A man whose days had been measured by the absence of others was learning to calibrate to presence. At night they sat by the fire, and sometimes spoke of things that didn't require a claim of history. She spoke of the way trails show where water will be. He talked about fences that had outlived their usefulness. There was a tradition to their silences. Silence was a cloth both knew how to handle, neither used it as a shield nor as a sword. In those hours, Jack felt his chest loosen in a way he had not expected. He was not an easy man to surprise anymore. The surprises that remained were softer, a shared joke over a burned pot, a traded memory of a particular dawn on the ridge. There were also nights when she did not speak at all, when the distant wind marked out a slow dirge. He learned to sit with those moments, to be present without the pressure to fix or to explain. Once, when the moon was thin and the cold pressed under the cabin walls, he remembered something more acute. A man in a blue coat, the smell of hay, the cry of a woman that came late and too sharp. He had turned away then, reasoning that taking sides would bring trouble, that a man could not spend his life in other people's fights. It was a decision that had kept his head down, kept his hands clean of blood, but not of responsibility. Now, with another human in his house, and with the pines listening like old witnesses, he felt that choice like a stone in his pocket. It was not a sharp guilt, so much as a recalibration. He had a ledger, and something in him wanted to balance it. He was not a tall man of brave gestures. He was a man who could stack wood for a season and open his door in a wind. That would have to be enough. The days folded into work that was both domestic and slow, repairing the lean of the back fence where cattle had pushed at it, oiling the hinges who had known rain a long time, replacing the broken peg on the front step. Each repair was an act of patience and a declaration that this house would hold. Jack did not speak grand words of belonging. He showed by hammer and stitch and coffee. Nessa showed by the small, steady competence of someone who had moved through hard country and kept moving. There were times when Jack watched her sleep with the same amazement he might have once reserved for a newborn colt, the way she breathed, even in rest, as if she were always poised to respond, the slow relaxation that came over her face as if she, too, was letting the house do what houses do, keep people warm. He found himself standing at his own threshold in the odd hours, listening to the house breathe, making sure the door was latched, making sure the wood was dry. And then, as happens in a country edged by open plains and hardened by shortage and rumor, the ridge showed its first hint of a passing thing. A column of dust far on the south, a pale smear that could be a wagon or the hide of a herd. Jack paused at the sight of it, because history had taught him to notice dust as one notices smoke. He felt the old reflex rise, the wish to look away, to not let his life be complicated by other people's friction. But the new muscle in his chest, a quiet firmness that had not been there before, held him. That afternoon, he found himself standing with his hand on a nail and thinking of the small ledger he was making in his days with Nisa. He thought of the nights he had kept his head down, and the nights he could have lifted it. He thought of shelter, simple and stern, and of the strange fact that asking for shelter could require a courage as honest as any drawn weapon. A rider went by the bottom pasture in the late low sun, a solitary figure who kept his distance, as if the news he carried might be infectious. Jack watched the man ride tight and steady, the horse's flanks steaming in the cold. When the rider had gone, Jack turned and saw the tracks, a fresh line in the mud that led toward the settlement below. dust and hoof, the small language of movement. He felt something like a bell ring in his chest. It wasn't alarm so much as notice that other lives were turning toward his. Nasa saw it too. She did not move to speak, but her hand tightened on the hammer for a second and then released it. Her face did not change. There was only a steady, contained readiness. The two of them looked at the window together, at the thin line of the trail that cut the ridge like a scar. Then she set down the hammer and poured tea into 2 cups, as if nothing uncertain were imminent. The week that followed after the Riders' Pass had its own rhythm, the exchange of messages at the fence line with a neighbor, the lowering of trade that had been customary through the winter. The settlement's people, who had always dealt in easy transactions and sterner silences, began to change the tempo of their visits. Goods came less often. Conversations became shorter. Jack felt the subtle shift in the social gravity around his cabin, a withdrawal, like a tide going out. He noticed traders who had once stopped for salt now ride past without a glance. With those absences came a question: why would folks keep their distance? Jack, who had once prided himself on measuring risk and staying out of other men's fights, felt the old muscle of indifference give way to a new instrument, curiosity that edged toward responsibility. He could have braced to be indifferent again. Instead, he found himself asking quiet questions of the wind as he stacked the firewood, or of the footprints that became irregular in the mud. He thought of Nisa's single quiet line: "Some peace costs too much." It was a sentence she had spoken once, almost as if she were reading a ledger of experience rather than sermonizing. It lodged in him like a splinter. Night after night the wind kept its edge. They ate together or with the table between them like a common altar. Soft conversation folded into longer silences. Once, when the moon made the pine's shadows thin and nervous on the floor, Nisa took his hand and pressed it between her palms, not a supplication or a seduction, merely an acknowledgement of the common warmth 2 hands can give. His hand stayed there, surprised at the steadiness of his own response. There were small exchanges with the settlement that tested what his shelter could be. A neighbor came by, selling furs, and eyed the extra cup on Jack's table with the kind of look that could be read as either suspicion or curiosity. He asked the normal, necessary questions about who had been on the road. Jack gave the normal, necessary answers, ambiguous, short, careful. The neighbor left with merchandise and with the same kind of silence that had come to mark the settlement. It was a small thing, but it felt like the first crack in a social mirror. Jack found himself thinking of stakes and balance, the ledger he kept in his quiet hours. It did not promise blessing or reward. It promised only consequence. Neighbors who might turn their horses away, trade that might dwindle, a door that would no longer see the same faces. He also thought, with an honesty he had not often allowed, about what it would mean to let a woman in and then hand her over when trouble came. The thought made his hands clench. It was a measure of a man's character, he told himself, whether he could undo old patterns and choose otherwise. A late afternoon sky broke open with the sound of hoofbeats that were not near enough to be worrying, but near enough to be noticed. Dust rose on the lower road, a column that trembled like a distant memory. Jack set down the plank he was planing and listened. He had been a man of avoidance for much of his life, a man who had found safety in not choosing fights that did not seem to require him. He had been a prudent man by some measures, a coward by others, and now he felt those 2 measures look at each other across the table. That night, when the wind had curled itself tight as a sleeping animal, he did the one thing that had become his practice. He went to the door and checked the latch. She was in the kitchen, moving a pot to the hearth, and did not look up when he closed the door behind him. He felt the house settle in the way it does when it acknowledges more than one life within it. He felt, too, a new kind of resolve that had the solid, quiet weight of wood stacked for winter. He would face the things that came like they were simple obligations, mending a fence, answering a knock. He would not retreat into the old calculus. Outside, a shadow moved along the ridge. Dust on the horizon was a thin, patient thing. Jack listened to it like a man who had finally learned to hear what's already been spoken. He thought of what it would mean to stand and to say, simply and without flourish, that this place had a right to shelter who came to it. The sentence formed in him like kindling waiting for a match. He did not yet know the cost. He did not have the speech prepared, but he felt with a certainty that surprised him that the answer to Nessa's request, stayed, had to be more than a single night's kindness. It had to be a willingness to stand for what had been given. When the first hoofbeat came into earshot, a hollow sound in the dark that made the pines seem to lean closer, Jack neither panicked nor celebrated. He moved with the calm of a man who had chosen the path of a small faith, actions rather than pronouncements. He took up the lantern, its oil sloshing steady, and went to the window. Nessa stood behind him in the same room, hands folded, face turned toward the same spot on the road. She did not ask him to do anything. She did not command him. She had asked only for a night. And now that night had stretched its limbs into something that might require the steadier muscle of decision. Jack tilted the lantern, watching the beam carve the dark. The shape on the ridge was a dark smudge first, then a shape with the slow dignity of a rider and a pair of men behind him. They were not yet close. He could see the way the riders kept space between each other, the way men go when they are carrying the weight of a town's opinion. Somewhere down below, a bell might be tolled in the mind of the settlement, an alarm that is not of metal but of gossip. He set the lantern down and felt the brief return of that old reflex, to worry about his own risk and preserve his quiet. But when he turned and looked at Nessa, he felt the warmth of the house like a small, bright command inside him. Her eyes met his, collected and unafraid. In that instant, he understood that the choice she had asked for at the door had not been only for tonight. It was a test of whether a man could choose to remain accountable. The hoofbeats moved closer in their own time. The wind threw its weight against the cabin, and the pines hissed. Jack felt the habitual cold press against him like an old coat he had worn for too long. He turned the lantern higher, and then, in a motion that felt more like a habit now than a decision, he moved to the door and set his hand upon the latch. If staying was an act, he thought, it was one you did openly, with the door latched and the shelf fixed and the cup washed. He breathed once and let the sound come out steady. He stepped toward the threshold and did not think of the cost. He thought instead of the small, exact acts that make up a life, the careful mending of a seam, the stacking of wood, the turning of a key to the latch. He had said yes once at the door. Now he would see what saying yes carried with it. Something in the dark shifted, as if the ridge itself took a breath. The hoofbeats were closer. Jack braced his shoulders and felt, for the first time in a long time, a strange kind of rightness in the act of not moving away. He had had his fill of quiet, of absence, of the easy safety of looking the other way. He had been given a chance to stay, literally, physically, and the thought settled into him like the first snow into the hedgerow. Not enough to smother the ground, but enough to change the way it sounded when you walked. The rider's silhouette cut the last line of horizon, and the dust came up in a small cloud. Jack took the lantern in both hands and opened the door. The smell of cold and hoarse and distant smoke came in. A voice called from the bottom of the yard, not unkind, but the kind that knows its power. "Mr. Redfern?" Jack's name struck the air, like the beginning of a sentence he had not rehearsed. He stepped out, lantern steady, and felt his heart measure the distance between what he had been and what he might be. He did not feel heroic. He felt aware. He felt ready. Inside, the hearth glowed and the house waited. Lisa's hand on the doorframe was still, and Jack saw in her face the same controlled patience he had come to trust. The riders were not yet at the gate, but the ridge had already been altered by the knowledge that strangers moved down below. The quiet he had cherished was no longer an end in itself, but the soil in which a new thing might grow. The decision to keep someone safe when it would be easier not to. He lifted the lantern and called back over his shoulder as the men trotted closer. "Come if you must. Speak quick. We have bread in the house." His voice did not wobble. The riders slowed, boots clicking on the packed track, and a man rode forward, the evening light catching his jaw. He did not look at Nessa, as if the having of her presence was an unsettled fact not to be examined too closely. Jack kept the lantern between them like a small, honest boundary. When the riders spoke, the words were formal and flat, the kind of language towns use when they are trying to wrap themselves in the comfort of procedure. "We're looking for someone," he said. "Seen near the settlement. Thought we might find her higher up." Jack's eyes did not leave the horse's head. He felt the old tug of that worn habit, yield and make trouble small, resist and make it larger. He thought of the ledger in his mind and the steady domestic acts that had altered the balance of his days. He lifted the lantern a fraction and let the light rest on the man's face. The man's mouth was a thin line. His eyes flicked once to the cabin, to the second cup on the table behind Jack, and then back to him. Jack's hand tightened on the lantern. The moment that had begun with a quiet knock and a whisper had unfolded into a question not just of hospitality, but of who he was willing to be. He realized then that staying was not merely tolerating the presence of another, it was defending a simple human choice against the quiet machinery of a town that liked its edges kept sharp. He met the rider's eyes and answered without a flourish, with the spare dignity that had carried him through winters. "She's here," he said. "She'll stay tonight." The rider blinked, the shadow under his hat folding in. Behind him the two men shifted on their mounts, the dust settling around their boots like a promise. The words hung in the cold air like a bell. The rider's jaw tightened. There were forms of displeasure he could read in the lines of his face. He pulled in a breath, and the conversation, restrained and cautious, began to spool outward. Jack did not flinch. He felt the change inside him as a quiet emergence. The old man who had avoided trouble had not vanished, but he had been given a new instrument, the ability to choose to stay. The ridge watched, and the pines kept their counsel. The riders drew closer, and the lantern light feathered their faces. The house behind him hummed with the small life of two people who had decided, in separate but overlapping ways, that shelter matters. Inside, their mugs cooled on the table. Outside, the rider's question found its way into the folds of the night. Jack breathed and felt the shape of a decision fill him like warm cloth. He had opened his door once. He would not close it now in cowardice. If there was a sermon in the ridge that night, it was a quiet one. Some things are redeemed not by thunder, but by the patient, stubborn muscle of a man who chooses to stay. The wind eased as if to listen. He set the lantern down and walked back into the house where a second cup waited on the table, a simple, unadorned witness to the choice he had made. If you have ever been asked a small favor that turns out to be a test, you know that the world measures such things in days, not in proclamations. He looked at Nessa, who met his gaze with steady eyes and a hint of something like relief. There was no triumph in either of them. There was only the ordinary human recognition that a life had changed course by a single deliberate act. The riders were at the gate now, men who carried town's habits and town's questions. Jack felt the press of consequence like the cold of the wind. He poured more tea, and the kitchen held the noise of two people drinking together. Beyond the window, hoofbeats came to a stop. The conversation outside became a low, economical exchange that might have been either negotiation or threat. Jack felt that his answer, uttered plainly at the threshold, had moved him from one kind of life into another. He did not know how far the settlement's displeasure would go. He did not know whether traders would return in the same way, or whether neighbors would keep to silence that was sharp as winter. He only knew the shape of his own hands on the kettle, the small comfort of a second mug, the steady presence beside him. In a country that measured men by their distance from trouble, he had chosen proximity. The hoofbeats resumed lower on the road, and then faded away like a tide. Inside, the house resumed its smaller music, wood on wood, the kettle's soft sigh, the fire's patient appetite. Jack sat back and felt the tiredness of a man who had shifted the axis of his life and had earned every ache. He looked at the peg by the door where her cloak hung, watched the steam lift from his cup, and felt the stern, quiet grace of a decision that had been made without trumpet or boast. Outside, the ridge stood as it always did, uncertain, unromantic, uncompromising. Inside, two people finished their tea and began the slow work of unmaking the loneliness of a life by carrying out the easy, steady acts that make a home, sweeping the hearth, stacking the next day's wood, tying a loose strap back into order. The world beyond the gate had not yet agreed with their choice, but within the cabin there was a new measure, the habitual actions of care. As the night grew older and the wind settled into its low, sustained sigh, Jack found himself standing in the doorway again, not because he feared the riders would return, but because he wanted to make sure the latch was set. He closed it with a certain finality, and then turned to see the house sink into a gentle darkness that was not empty. He felt, in the quiet that followed, the modest, unadorned joy of a man who had learned that to stay could be brave. If this story has found its way to you, and the weight of a small choice rests in your hands, stay with it. See what one decision, asked in a whisper and answered in an ordinary voice, can do to the shape of a life. They slept that night under a roof that had been saved, perhaps, from losing its certainty. Outside, the ridge kept its watch. In the morning, they would repair the steps and speak with whoever came down the trail. For now, the house was a place that had chosen to hold another. Jack had said yes at the door. He was learning by slow and steady rent what staying means. But choices set things in motion, and the road that runs down from the settlement does not forget its own rhythms. Dust gathers, rumors form, old bargains are remembered. Jack knew this. He had seen the way men could close themselves off when asked to make room. The next days would show whether the decision to keep a stranger safe would be counted in kindness or in stubbornness. For now, he let the lantern gutter to a warm glow and folded his hands in his lap. When the first clear bell of morning came, it brought with it more tracks in the mud, horses that had not been there the night before. Jack rose, set the kettle, and felt the same tightened readiness that had come over him the evening before. The ridge felt watchful. The pines seemed to brace against whatever news the day might carry. He walked to the window, and the trail below glittered with the marks of passage. He did not yet know the faces that would come up the road. He only knew that he had made one simple choice at his threshold, and that choice would require more of him than a single night. He set his jaw and turned to the room where Nessa gathered a spare blanket and a rope. Their life, small as it was, had altered the map of the ridge. Jack took up the hammer he'd been using the day before and set about repairing the fence. The nails went in with the noise he had grown to trust, and as he worked, he felt the taste of something like hope, slim, pragmatic, and stubbornly human. The world would test their decision in the days to come. The settlement would answer in its own time. He drove the nails until his hands were raw, until the board stayed tight and the fence had the honest line of a thing that would hold. Then, when the work was done, he stood and looked at the horizon, at the faint line of smoke where the town lay, and at the small track that had brought trouble and also a person who chose to stay. He breathed deep and felt the ridge answer with a wind that was not wholly cold. The choice had been made. The consequences were waiting, as they always do. He set his hat back on his head, packed the spare tools, and walked back toward the house where two mugs sat drying on the rack, proof of an ordinary covenant. Simple hospitality met with a willingness to defend it. He was no preacher, he would not call it virtue, but he had decided, in the weather and the wood and the small bending of his days, to be someone who stayed. Outside, the road carried the rumor of men moving along the low road, the way a town travels on the back of its own questions. Jack watched them come with the same careful measurement he had learned to give movement. The set of a shoulder, the steadiness of a rein, the way a rider keeps his expression as blank as a fence post. They arrived in a small, practiced parade, one man riding forward with a confidence that had been polished by many small triumphs, two others behind him like punctuation. The leader swung down from his saddle with a quick, neat motion and folded his reins over the pommel. He was a broad-shouldered sort, hair thinned at the temples, face taut with the habit of speaking for 100 other people. He carried the sort of politeness that was heavy enough to bruise. Jack had seen that tone before, men whose civility was a glove over a clenched fist. He introduced himself with a tilt of the chin that named the town more than the man. Silas Grilly. Silas scanned the cabin with a look that catalogued everything as either useful or suspect. His two men stood a pace behind him, hands unconsciously near their saddlebows. The horse's breath smoked in the cold. For a moment the world held as if waiting for an instruction. "Mr. Redfern," Silas began, his voice practiced to balance accusation and courtesy. "Word came through that a woman had been seen riding toward the ridge. Folks are anxious. We wondered if you'd seen anything." Jack kept his hands where he could see them, on the lantern he had brought to the door, and by habit, still smelling faintly of oil and the house. "She's here," he answered plainly, feeling the steadiness of a man who had learned to make choices. "She's had shelter these last nights." Silas's eyes moved at once to the cabin behind Jack, taking in the 2 mugs drying on the rack, the cloak on the peg. He did what all men practiced in towns when a thing threatened their neat categories. He asked for paperwork, for permission, for the easy logic that would let him hand a person back to the crowd. "We need to know who she is," he said. "Our people saw her near town. It would be best if she come down. It's the way we keep things safe." There it was, the soft weapon. Safety as a justification for making other people uncomfortable. Jack heard the crowded shapes of the town's fears in Silas's phrasing. He felt, beneath his ribs, the ledger yet again, debts paid in withheld favors and small, steady acts of conscience. He thought of the warm kettle and the 2 mugs, of Nisa's hands at the table, of the way she had repaired a shelf without fuss. "She's under my roof," Jack said. "She stays." Silas's mouth narrowed. He had the patience to press, and the 2 men behind him shifted, as if ready to be told to act. "Mr. Redfern, I'm not here to make trouble for you, but people are uneasy. If there's someone who might bring trouble to our door, you understand we'd ask them to answer for it." Jack set the lantern down on the stoop and fixed Silas with a gaze that had more weight to it than a man of few words often showed. "Ask her what you will," he said, "but you will not drag her from this house." There was no flourish. There was only the kind of plain language that belongs to men who repair things with their hands. For a beat, Silas studied Jack, as if measuring whether the man would be whatever was required, a barricade or a bargaining partner. Then he glanced toward the window where, in the mottled glass, the faint outline of another body was visible. Nisa stood framed there, shoulders straight, expression composed. She had not stepped forward, she had not spoken, she had not asked for Jack to defend her. She simply was, and that quietness had a force of its own. "Miss," Silas called then, softer, because there was a town's etiquette even in threat. "Come down, we only want to ask a few questions." Nisa moved, but she did not come to the door like a supplicant. She walked down the boards with the same kept economy she had shown all week. No dramatics, no appeal to pity. She stepped into the light of the lantern as if into a place where facts could be named plainly. For a moment, the 2 sides considered each other like animals that knew the distance of one another. "I will speak with who asks," she said, her voice even. "But I will not go where I am taken without my choosing." Silas's expression shifted. He did not like that she answered on her own terms. He tried to reframe it for the town's comfort. Procedure, precaution. We only meant to ensure safety. All the phrases that make exclusion sound reasonable. Jack felt something in himself that was no longer simply self-preservation. It was an instrument forged in the small, repeated acts of the days before. The second cup set down without thought, the fence renailed. He pushed forward the one thing he had learned to hold, that shelter is not a commodity to be bargained away. "She'll answer questions here," Jack said. "You'll sit at my table. You'll ask what you must. But she doesn't go where you take her." Silas smiled the smile of a man used to moving other people's boundaries by degrees. "You expect us to ride into town empty-handed and tell our folks we left without the answers?" he asked. "Do you know what'll happen to your trade, Mr. Redfern? Folks will think you harbor trouble and they'll pass you by." "It won't change what I do for a living," Jack replied. "If they pass me by, they'll pass by me. But this house keeps who it keeps." The riders exchanged low words. One of them spat at the ground and then looked up, uncertain whether his discomfort would be rewarded. The threat of economic ostracism was the town's quietest weapon. Withdrawal of favors, the stoppage of small kindnesses that kept a life angular and easy. It could make a man small in ways that bruised more than a fist. Silas weighed his options as if he were cutting a strip of thin cloth. At last he said, with a caution that was designed to feel like mercy, "You do what you will, Mr. Redfern. But understand this, you took a stand, and towns, remember, if you insist on this, don't expect the same trade or the same visits. You might find doors shut that used to open." Jack met his eyes. He thought of the ledger. He thought of the nights he'd kept his head down. He thought of Nessa, of the simple steadiness she had brought to his house. "I understand," he said. "We can live with the consequence." Silas looked past him, at the two mugs, at the peg with a cloak on it. For the first time he seemed to feel the ordinariness of what Jack had refused to part with, the right to shelter a person in a place where shelter mattered. He nodded once, short and decisive, then returned to his saddle. His two men swung up behind him with that same practiced nonchalance that was a town's answer to risk. The horses moved, the dust briefly rose, and then they rode away, the sound of hooves drawing the conversation back down the road. They left with a warning and an implied tally. You have chosen, and unchosen things have consequences. Jack watched them go until their silhouettes were swallowed by the ridge. The pines breathed. The cabin hummed with the small life of two people who had, by quiet acts, altered the map of a place. For days after, the change Silas had predicted folded itself into Jack's life like a slow tide. Traders that had once stopped for salt or rope passed without a glance. A neighbor who had only ever nodded in passing now skirted the field as if he were avoiding a plant that stung. The settlement's people rearranged their walking. Their visits abbreviated themselves into necessary transactions. The ledger Jack kept on his bedside table was filled now with different entries: a missing bale of hay, a visit that did not come, the silence at the trading post. It would have been easy, and in a certain economy practical, to count those silences as punishment. Instead, Jack found that their absence carved out a space he had not expected. He had time. Time to mend and to build, to watch and to measure, to allow the small acts that had begun to remake him to accumulate without pressure. He understood the social cost as a price, but one he had already decided was worth the keeping. There was a steadiness in that acceptance, a kind of patient courage that had less glory and more bone. Nessa moved among the days like someone who had always tended hard ground. She mended clothes sent in by neighbors who still dared to trade at a distance. She offered to repair a child's shoe left on a step. She taught Jack a way to split wood that made his shoulders ache less. She did not accept pity or make herself fragile to coax mercy. She lived, which was in itself a claim. There was, too, a subtle economy of trust that settled between them. Jack realized he had begun to plan not only for the immediate day, but for a future that involved another person. He considered where a shelf could hold more than cups, where a corner could be turned into a place for seeds, where a small patch outside might hold herbs for tea. The hopes were modest, practical, a place for a second bed, a row to plant beans, a better peg for a cloak. Each was a small form of commitment. Neighbors' cold shoulders stung for a while. Jack noticed the way some men avoided meeting his gaze. Children, less practiced in wariness, sometimes peered from wagons and asked questions their parents shut down. But there were also slow returns of other things. A neighbor who brought a broken harness and accepted Nesa's help with a nod. A trader who left a bag of salt unstoppably on Jack's step with no word but a little exchange of goods. The town's response was not monolithic. People are made of smaller parts that sometimes surprise us. The friction of suspicion began to wear at the town's edges in its own time. People observed as they will, and some sat with an internal tally. Did Jack lose much? Did the winter spare him? One or two passed through to trade quietly, surprised to find warmth and a shared laugh at the table. The great machine of rumor does not always finish what it starts. It sometimes runs down, bored by its own heat. In the slow afternoons, Jack and Nisa worked at the cabin and at themselves. They built a low shelf in the pantry, the kind whose angle shows that a man expects to keep jars and bottles for years. Nisa hung a small cloth inside the shelf, its pattern simple and not meant to display anything except order. Jack watched her do it and felt something like a knot untie. They spoke in small confessions. One evening, as the sky bruised to purple, Jack found himself admitting a different debt, less one owed outwardly, more one owed inwardly. "I left things when I should have stayed," he said, the sentence tasting of winter and old regret. He did not expect judgment. He offered it as a fact that shaped the man he had been. Nessa listened. Then she reached across the table and touched the place where his hand rested. Her fingers were warm and rough and certain. "People do what they must," she said. "Staying is harder than leaving. It means you answer when question comes." Her words were spare, practical, and they landed in his chest not as rebuke but as instruction. He looked at her and felt gratitude that had less to do with being saved and more with being seen. The house had become, through small decisions and repeated care, a place that made room for that seeing. Winter loosened into a late thaw. The ridge's snowbanks receded, carrion of ice leaking into gullies. New tracks began to appear, hares and foxes, a neighbor's wagon that no longer avoided the field. Trade resumed in small ways. The town's people, having weighed their options, discovered that the life of the ridge was not changed by a single act of hospitality, even if some of their own hearts were tested by it. They returned to their own routines, with the quiet recalibration that often follows discomfort. Some doors would open again, some would stay shut for a time. The world refused to hurt itself only because a man decided to stay. In the spring, Jack found himself planting a narrow row of beans near the house, Nessa at his side, both of them humming the economy of two hands. They worked in companionable silence, measuring the soil with fingers that had learned to trust the other's presence. When they finished, they sat with the ache of honest exertion and watched the ridge, now green at its edges, breathe. A few months later, a traveler from the settlement stopped by and stayed longer than the town's etiquette would have predicted. He spoke of small things, the price of cattle, the weather, the truth that no town has unanimous opinion. He watched as Jack and Nisa moved around one another, how they folded 2 cups into a drying rack and shared the chores of a house. The traveler left without fanfare, but he did not ride away with the certainty with which he'd come. Perhaps, he thought, People change places with less ceremony than gossip makes them. Jack's ledger did not clear itself, as if by miracle. There were times when a crate did not arrive, when a credit he expected was withheld. But there were also returns that had not existed before. A neighbor who asked him to look at a broken gate, and asked Nessa too, as if acknowledging her skill had become a necessary courtesy. The settlement's wrath had not disappeared. It had reshaped itself into a cautious accommodation. Months moved with the low, certain rhythm of seasons. The cabin gained a sturdier peg on the porch, a new board on the stoop, and in the corner a small stool Nisa made from a tree that had fallen during a wind. The small domestic changes were evidence of a life being built slowly. No sudden declarations, no grand ceremony. The change resided in the way Jack thought of tomorrow now, as if it might contain tea for two, and in how Nessa kept a spare blanket ready without fuss or announcement. In time, when the wood smoke settled and the ridge lay quiet as a thing that had been examined and found to be simply itself, Jack understood the true cost and the true value of his choice. He had lost, in some small measure, the shrugging safety of a life where no one demanded anything of him beyond his own labor. In return, he had gained a companionship that was not bright with drama, but deep with the accumulative goodness of shared days. There were moments late at night when he would stand at the doorway and feel the breeze and think of his ledger. Sometimes regret still perched lightly, a memory sharpened by old choices. But increasingly, it was accompanied by something else, a steady, quiet conviction that small, persistent acts were themselves a kind of grace. He thought of the way the house carried their laughter now, the way the hearth hummed not as an echo, but as a presence. He felt rewarded by the ordinary. One evening, as the light settled into a slow amber and the pines threw long, soft shadows, Jack and Nisa sat with mugs warming their hands. In the hush, Jack spoke the plain truth he had been learning to hold. "I thought staying was easier," he admitted. "I thought moving on kept a man alive, but it took me meeting you to see that staying is part of courage. It's work." Nessa looked into her cup and then at him. "It is work," she agreed, "and a choice. People who stay have to be ready for the cost. They must make shelter a thing worth keeping." They sat together in the twilight, mending the things that had frayed in the course of living, belts, hinges, the smaller frays of the heart. Months braided themselves into a pattern neither of them had expected when the wind first knocked, and a request had been made with no more than a few words. "May I be warm tonight?" No thunder answered that night, only the measured thump of two lives settling into a shared rhythm. Jack understood now that his decision had not been an act of solitary heroism. It was a kind of common faith that the small choice to keep another is a stake driven into the ground of a life, and that stakes, however modest, guide the way things grow. The ridge had not been transformed into a different world. It had simply absorbed one more human decision and adjusted. That was enough. In the quiet hours, he sometimes thought of larger stories he had heard. Tales of men who had walked into storms and undone wrongs with weapons and speeches. His own story was quieter. A man who answered a knock, fixed a shelf, and refused to turn someone over to a town's anxieties. He had not made enemies into friends with a speech. He had made a small life together, and in doing so he had felt an unfamiliar peace. And there was, he could not deny it, a subtle feeling that the world sometimes rewards courage, not with riches or miracles, but with the soft return of something like grace. He thought of the hands that reached out for him in small ways, the neighbor who left a basket of apples, the trader who lingered with a smile. He allowed himself rarely and gratefully to call that return a kind of blessing, not a promise from the heavens that all would be easy, but a recognition that the world will answer, in its own time, the people who choose to endure. If there is a spiritual language available here, it was humble and unassuming. Perhaps there is a spirit, call it what you will, that moves in the people who open a way for others. Jack did not speak theology at the table. He spoke of wood, of nails, of the importance of keeping a roof sound. Yet when he allowed himself to look up and name the quiet joy he felt, he admitted to a simple belief that human courage, ordinary and repeated, is itself a kind of grace. Nessa stayed, not as someone taken in pity or as a token of bravery, but as a person whose presence altered the rhythm of the house. In the months that followed, she and Jack built a life that was not announced to trumpets. They simply lived, and in living proved that the radical act of staying, literal, moral, human, can change the course of a life in ways that no single declaration could. The ridge kept its weather and its moods, the pines their endless counsel. But somewhere between the repaired fence and the shelf that now held 2 jars of preserves, a different quiet took root. A man learned that to stay could be brave, and a woman chose, of her own will, to remain. It was not the end of their story. No story ends, but it was a durable beginning. If this little narrative has struck a chord, if you have a memory of having been asked to stay, or of being the one who stayed, consider sharing it. Tell someone what it cost you, or what it returned. And if you would like more stories of ordinary courage and quiet change, subscribe and come back. There are many more ridgetop mornings to tell. The wind moved on, as it always does, but the house stood warmer than before. They kept the door latched against night's sharpness, and kept the kettle warm against the morning. Jack Redfern had learned the measure of a man is not only in what he leaves behind, but in what he chooses to protect. Nessa Greyhawk had made the same choice in a different form: to be seen and to remain. The ridge listened, and then turned its attention elsewhere, because life has many small reckonings, and courage is often the quiet kind that stays.